Hang up if you've heard this one before. There's a girl, alone in a house. It's late. Maybe she's the babysitter. Maybe her parents are out and she's waiting for her boyfriend to come round. She's in the living room, watching TV, when the phone starts to ring.
Hello?
The sinister phone call is a much-loved staple of the horror genre. It's a way for the killer to get close to their victim without being in the same room. But the phone is more than a plot device. It's a rich symbol for many of our modern fears. The fear that we're being listened to and monitored. The fear of technology and the media itself. Of depersonalization, domestic invasion, and sexual assault. The recent history of the telephone has moved in step with evolutions in cinematic horror. As the phone has taken a progressively central place in our lives, horror too has transformed, catering to the specific fears of each generation. It could be argued that the phone has had a direct, even seismic impact on the whole genre. There is a crisp, clear connection between horror and the phone, and this is that story, from the very beginning. In the early days of cinematic horror, the genre was firmly rooted in the conventions of its gothic influences. There was little chance of Dracula or Dr. Caligari having you in their phone book, because so few horror films were set in the modern day. But then, Jacques Tourneur arrived. Armed with an RKO contract, he made low-budget horror films in contemporary settings, including 1942's Cat People, that features this phone call, picked up among the shadows and expressionist lighting that made his film so timeless. Tourneur was the exception, though, and in the 1940s the fearful phone call made more of an impact in another genre, film noir. In 1948's Sorry Wrong Number, Barbara Stanwyck overhears the plotting of a murder during the coincidence of a cross connection. And 1945's Detour features an ironic and macabre strangulation by phone cord, prefiguring something that would become a common occurrence in horror. Dial M for Murder also wraps its plot around a series of eventful phone calls, including this typically tense Hitchcock set piece. During the 1950s, there was a whole host of sci-fi monsters that had as much use for the telephone as Dracula did. It wasn't until the early 60s when we started to receive some calls from the other side. Here, in the creepy French classic Eyes Without a Face, the presumed dead Christiane calls her lover, and through the static he hears the voice of a woman he thought dead. The film sets an early and highly poetic standard that few have matched. But for the first calls that truly come from beyond the grave, we have to travel to the small screen and cross over into the Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone was known for its dark twist endings and the cool, calculated on-screen narration of its creator, Rod Serling. But its high episode count and slim budgets meant that many episodes resembled one another and often revolved around simple props and locations. So it's no surprise that the dead make a number of phone calls during the show's original run. In Long Distance Call, a young boy starts to receive phone calls from his late grandmother, through a toy telephone that she gave him before her death. And Night Call features an elderly woman who starts receiving halting phone calls from a voice that resembles her dead husband's, which, in traditional twisty Twilight Zone style, is the result of a loose phone line falling onto his grave. It's not until 1961's Night of the Eagle where the phone itself becomes an item worthy of fear. In this macabre British entry, occult and illicit signals are sent down the phone line. This is the first use of the telephone to transmit a curse or malicious signal, something that would become a steadfast trope in supernatural horror.
Hang on, Norman!
In 1965, Roman Polanski exploited the psychological potential of the phone. Repulsion is full of unsettling disembodied voices and the Freudian fear of penetration. For Catherine Deneuve's character, every man outside her apartment is a potential intruder, and her phone is their first passage inside. In this scene, it's used to probe her progressively delusional anxieties. The phone calls she receives are assaults on her increasingly fragile sense of security and reality. Repulsion predicts how the phone will be used throughout the 70s, 80s and beyond, as a device through which women will be terrorized by potential killers and voices from the unknown. In Rosemary's Baby, Polanski returned, using the phone to scratch at the paranoia inherent in urban isolation. Bad news and tragic accidents rarely occur on screen, but are relayed through the phone, playing on the all-too-real fear that the telephone could deliver devastating news at any time in any of our lives. As Rosemary's situation becomes more desperate, she attempts to use the telephone as a way out of her isolation, but she is always framed as trapped and spied upon whenever she attempts to reach the outside world. While Polanski was content to prod at our psyches, over in Italy, a crowd of directors were already taking things a step further. As with roads, ice cream, and designer sunglasses, the Italians got there first. The masked killers of Giallo films were already in full spree by the mid-60s, long before the American slasher movie had made its first stabs into the cinematic canvas. If you're unfamiliar with Giallo, it's a prolific Italian genre born from the yellow-covered pulp thrillers that also inspire its name. They are full of leather-gloved killers, gruesome, elaborate deaths, and innocent protagonists who are inadvertently caught up in the investigation. The master of Italian horror, Mario Bava, kicked things off in 1963 with the first Giallo film shot in colour, Black Sabbath, an anthology film that starts with a segment called The Telephone, where we follow Rosie, a French call girl who starts receiving dark messages from a voice she recognises. Bava followed Black Sabbath up with 1964's Blood and Black Lace, a superbly stylish murder mystery set in a high-end fashion house, plagued by rumours and intrigue. Here, the killer frequently uses the phone to lure his victims from safety, and the phones are more than props, drawing attention to themselves whenever they're on screen, oversized and painted in bright red to match the luminescent artificial blood being shed. In 1970, Dario Argento made his Giallo debut with The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, in which his leather-loving killer taunts his victim down the phone. Argento's hit spread Giallo global, and was quickly followed by an underseen but brilliantly downbeat Short Night of the Glass Dolls, which makes frequent use of claustrophobic phone booths. They may have all but disappeared from our streets today, but the phone booth was a reliable everyday setting that could illustrate our fears of surveillance and powerlessness. It's no Giallo, but I want to quickly highlight this obscure but brilliant Spanish short from 1972, La Cabina, which begins as a Hulot-esque skit on the cruelty of crowds and morphs into an absurd, deeply sinister story about a man captive to a senseless fate. Although Giallo films featured a number of killers on the other end of the phone, few of them truly made use of the device's terrible potential. It was the American slasher film that promoted the phone from supporting role to fully fledged horror star. John Carpenter's Halloween shot the slasher into the mainstream. Michael Myers' Haddonfield killing spree is so iconic that his shape still haunts the cinema today. His presence is so demanding that all he needs to do is breathe into the receiver to inspire fear. And throttle one of his teen victims with the telephone cord, of course. Halloween may be the gold standard for the slasher movie, but it wasn't the first. It was a dark and starry night in 1974 where the telephone truly began its horror heyday. Black Christmas drew the blueprint for all subsequent slasher films, centered on the inhabitants of a single sorority house and the killer who threatens them with obscene, psychotic phone calls. Despite its crude reputation, Black Christmas is actually a pretty politically progressive film, with a nastiness that still shocks. It was the first of many slasher films to play on the urban legend of the babysitter and the man upstairs. In 1979, When a Stranger Calls spends its opening 20 minutes directly adapting the urban legend. You know the basic story. A babysitter, alone in the house, receives a series of skin-crawling phone calls telling her to check on the kids upstairs.
Hello?
Why haven't you checked the children?
Eventually, the babysitter calls the police, who trace the call and find that they're coming from.
Inside the house. A squad car's on the way over there right now.
The film was so successful that it spawned a slew of copycat phone killer thrillers, starting with 1980's Don't Answer the Phone, and followed by New York Ripper, which features a duck-voiced killer caller and some very unsavoury violence. It only takes a few years for the phone trend to fall victim to the unavoidable absurdity of escalation. Filmmakers, after all, have to up the ante. 1982's Murder by Phone is perhaps the most glaring example of this, in which a disgruntled phone technician finds a way to send a special frequency down the line that kills anyone who picks up. A schlocky, very silly movie that just about gets by on its bonkers premise alone. 1988's Dial Help somehow manages to top Murder by Phone's madness, with more phone-related demises than you can shake a receiver at. The telephones are literally haunted here, and are able to fling themselves through windows and set fire to rooms. Although this film is tremendously cheesy, it's pretty difficult not to love a film that features a scene of death by loose change.
I just called to say I love you.
And then there's Robert Englund's directorial debut, 976 Evil, that takes things supernatural with a phone line connected straight to the bowels of hell. The trend was so pervasive that you can see its influence in many of the canonical horror classics of the era, from the slasher mainstay Prom Night, to Poltergeist, to Freddy Krueger's perverse entry in A Nightmare on Elm Street. Even Jonathan Demme's Oscar-winning Silence of the Lambs concludes with Hannibal calling Clarice for one last chat and a delicious parting line.
I do wish we could chat longer, but I'm having an old friend for dinner. Bye.
By the time 1996 rolls around, the trend has come full circle in Scream, which effectively borrows When a Stranger Calls' entire introduction in its meta and highly effective first 10 minutes. From Giallo to Scream, the phone is a symbolic totem. It's a Freudian dream item that, when combined with the threat of violence, is a representation of bodily invasion and sexual assault. It's no coincidence that the killer on the phone is usually terrorizing young, vulnerable women, and they're often in their bedrooms, in various states of undress. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, but not in this case.
It's not your sister. It's you, lover.
But that doesn't mean the phone cannot be used to put us on the line with deeper, more existential forms of dread.
You need help. You're going insane. I can hear you disintegrating while you talk to me.
In David Cronenberg's Videodrome, a caller describes her anxieties to a radio show host.
I hate my sister. I don't want to. It's ripping me up inside.
She articulates her pain in terms of disintegration and depersonalization, and Cronenberg's film is all about the dehumanizing capacity of broadcast technology. This will require a little more unpacking, so let's start with what I think is possibly the creepiest phone scene in all of cinema.
What do you mean you're where right now?
At your house. That's fucking crazy, man. Call me. Dial your number. I told you I was here.
How'd you do that?
Lost Highway's mystery man demonstrates his omnipotence through his mobile phone. In doing so, he fractures our reality. Through this one phone call, we, with the main character, are totally unmoored in a world of the uncanny. From here, anything can happen. This is the existential damage that communication technology posits, that we are edging towards a reality that will be alien to us and consume us regardless. It's the transformative modernist horror of nightmares, played out fully in Videodrome's techno-sexual body horror spectacles and the nauseating mechanical mutations of 1989's Tetsuo, the Iron Man. We're afraid of our phones because we are afraid of any technology that moves too fast and that inserts itself as a necessity of human interaction. We are at the phone's mercy, as it's difficult or impossible to live a normal life without one. This became more obvious as we approached the new millennium, and the killer phone genre started to receive some significant international calls. Although the original Ringu is best remembered for the emergence of its long-haired ghost, the real source of terror throughout the film is technology itself. The film is much more restrained than you might remember, with barely any gore and very few supernatural events. The audience is instead put on edge by the static of a television, the blur of a photograph, and the fateful ringing of a phone. In similar fashion, Korea's Phone is all about a haunted mobile number, where its sudden ringing gets more scares than the inevitable appearance of the ghost that haunts it. Then we arrive at 2001's techno-thriller, Pulse, which is ripe for critical re-evaluation. Scarier now than it was on release, because it so explicitly taps into anxieties of social isolation and the consuming nature of the internet. Its use of outdated tech a few steps away from what we're all used to gives the film an eerie prophetic relevance as a warning of what has already come to pass. Master provocateur Takeshi Miike made his contribution to the genre in One Missed Call, in which a sadistic spirit reaches out with a sinister ringtone and leaves a recording of your future demise. Like Lost Highway, the phone becomes a device that is capable of warping reality and our normal perceptions of space and time. As with Ringu and the 70s horror inspired by The Babysitter and The Man Upstairs, One Missed Call also owes a large debt to urban legend. Both it and Ringu feature very similar scenes in which the main character learns the spooky lore of the film from schoolgirls gathered outside the funeral of the first victim. These films mine the mobile for all the terror that can be taken from them. The cursed phones of these techno-chillers have a slew of victims. But the mobile phone had a bigger target in its sights: the horror genre itself. Hang up if you've heard this one before. A group of teenagers are spending a weekend at a cabin in the woods. They settle in, maybe have a party, and then something creepy starts to happen. There's someone in the woods with them. Then they call the police, the lunatic escaped from the insane asylum is apprehended, and all the kids get home safe before their parents have even started to worry. Where the phone once facilitated the structure of a horror film, it has now become the device which has most convincingly deconstructed it. Slasher movies, home invasion stories, and any subgenre that features human threats has to contend with the problem of the mobile phone. How many classic horror movie premises can be derailed once you give the terrified protagonist an iPhone and full bars? And screenwriters have tied themselves in expositional knots in order to take the phone out of the equation. In the Hills Have Eyes remake, it's quickly established that they are stranded in an area with no signal. And You're Next features a team of killers who take out an entire family using a phone jammer in the back of their car while they carry out the deed. Even Jordan Peele's exceptional Get Out has Chris make frequent reference to the fact that someone is taking his phone off charge. I should point out that this doesn't mean we haven't had some traditional phone horror throughout the 21st century. There was Dead Tone, End Call, the American remakes of Ringu and One Missed Call, and 2016's high-budget flop, Cell. Most of these were derivative of the films we've already covered, but one I think that's well worth highlighting is 2008's Pontypool, a cerebral, low-budget zombie film set entirely within the confines of a radio station. The rise of the mobile and smartphones has had other far-reaching consequences for the genre. We've seen a resurgence of spooky supernatural fare, because what good is a phone going to be when you're staring down a vengeful spirit summoned by your past misdeeds? Deep in-ear settings are also helpful when you want to shed the phone completely. And there are films like It Follows, which occur in a sort of dream logic world where it's neither the past nor the present. One could even chalk up the emergence of whole subgenres as a result of the phone's influence. Could the torture porn genre's popularity in the 2000s be a byproduct of the availability of mobile phones? Its captive characters in tightly controlled environments, conveniently separated from their phones for the duration of the plot. And then there's the explosive popularity of zombie films and series like The Purge, where all of society falls apart, and as a result, there's no one left to call. When we think about it like this, maybe the phone hasn't killed the genre at all. Perhaps it's accelerated the genre's reinvention. There may have been some clunky exposition along the way, but it's also inspired horror filmmakers to break from conventional formulas and attempt something new. Like its best-loved villains, horror never really dies. It's a genre that just reinvents itself to keep up with the modern world. It will always be relevant because as fast as technology moves, our fears and our anxieties are never far behind.